And I think for me, in studying the 19th century as well, there's always this problem of source material. There's always this problem of like how and where can you find Black women telling their stories, right? Like from their perspective and like offering kind of like their interpretation. And those sources are so few and far between. And I often find myself looking at sources that were sources that emerged from the effort to police or surveil Black women, right? And like look into their lives and their personal business in a way that your grandmother would never allow, you know what I mean, would never sort of allow to happen. And so this kind of raises these questions of the ethics of this kind of work for me.
Grandmas hold a special place in our culture. We cherish their endless love. We admire their skills in the kitchen. We rely on them as babysitters. We hold them up as examples of honesty and moral purity. But did my grandmother and the women like her make such sacrifices out of choice or due to a lack of choice? To meet the expectations set for them by society to be a strong, eat last type of matriarch? Were they the result of wonderful character traits or the oppressive demands of American society, or both? For our grandmothers, what are the motivations and forces behind their seemingly superhuman abilities? What's going on, y'all? It's Jordan Theory with Dream Chase Life. Thanks for tuning in to episode 7 of Grandma's Roses. In this episode, I go and speak with a historian, a professor at Wake Forest University, who specializes in a really interesting area of Black history, the Mississippi River Valley, and particularly the river world of that. And so the reason I want to talk to a historian, I know we usually are interviewing grandmothers, is because I want to start to build in the scholars who can kind of add some context and speak for some of the women that are no longer here. And so this sister I met through my good friend and colleague, Micah Gilmer. Thanks, Micah, for the connect. We had a really great discussion about the slavery era and women's role in this river world that she specializes her research in. So enjoy the episode.
My name is Alisha Hines, and I am an assistant professor in the history department at Wake Forest University.
And can you tell us what your specialization is?
My research and teaching interests include slavery and gender in the U.S. And also in the broader Atlantic world. Specifically, I study Black women in the Mississippi River Valley in the Civil War era. So the kind of origin story of more recent kind of scholarship on slavery, the Black family, the Black community really comes from a moment where the Black family is being dehumanized and demoralized publicly through things like the Moynihan Report, which describes the Black family as being caught in this tangle of pathology as a result of the slave experience. Ronald Reagan making comments about, welfare queens, Black mothers as welfare queens. And so there's this sort of response that comes from the discipline where scholars are trying to narrate the Black family in slavery in a way that restores its kind of dignity and integrity. And Black women scholars sort of come after this and say, well, actually, if you apply these frameworks to talk about the Black family in this way, you really actually don't fully understand the experience of enslaved women, the kinds of oppression that they faced, the ways that they resisted their positions. And so in many ways, this crowds out an understanding of Black women as mobile and as sort of agents of their own kind of destinies, right, in pursuit of freedom, for example, because many people find that enslaved women were tied to plantations because they had children, right, or because they had families. And this is kind of a pervasive trope, I say, in American slavery studies, that really doesn't allow us to see Black women as mobile, as sort of seeking freedom in these ways that men typically did. And so we lack the kind of interpretive language to understand their stories and fit them into our narratives. And so sort of in the 2000s, this shifts a little bit with Stephanie Camp's Closer to Freedom. She talks about Black women's spatial practices and Black women's mobility, but it's still kind of in the context of the plantation South. And so I see sort of my work as moving outside of that plantation landscape and into this riverscape where several thousands of Black women moved and pursued their freedom, right, and moved between these boundaries of slavery and freedom in ways that I think are really useful to help us create new language and create new interpretive dynamics for understanding women who don't fit easily into the kind of constructs that exist.
One of the first questions I had for Dr. Hines was about Black women's labor in this era and what was unique about it in this Mississippi River world that she researches, because we often think about in slavery, either women working in the fields or working in the big house, and that's sort of the dichotomy that's portrayed. But I know that it's much more dynamic than that now after speaking with Dr. Hines.
So I think any historian or scholar of enslaved women really has to constantly grapple with this question of Black women's labor and economic power, particularly because we have to consider the context in which they labor both productively in terms of their service, right, their kind of physical labor, and also their reproductive labor. So the fact that the condition of slavery follows the mother, right, in this moment. And so in terms of maternity, motherhood, that is a certain kind of labor that has economic consequences, in addition to the kind of labor that they perform, right, in whatever capacity. So in my work, it's interesting because the women that I study who work on these boats are sometimes able to earn wages for their labor, right? But sometimes they don't have access, right, to these wages. So their owner might have a relationship with a captain of a boat, and they will negotiate the wages that an enslaved woman would earn, and then the owner goes and he, collects the wages from the boat owner. And so in that context, I try to understand what an individual chambermaid, what an individual Black woman gains from this experience of having this freedom of movement. And sometimes, I come to the conclusion that having these familial connections, this kind of kinship, this access to kinship. So if you are working on a boat and you can travel between, St. Louis and New Orleans, for example, you might be able to visit a child. You might be able to look for a child who was sold away from you or, who was taken from you in some context. And so I find that while it doesn't have sort of accrued economic value, it has this significance for these women. And so these questions are all kind of, connected and inextricable in a way. And so I try to, as much as I can, foreground the fact that, although wages, right, money, economic power is important, there are other kinds of value systems that we can use to understand Black women's labor experiences.
The other thing I really wanted to ask Dr. Hines about was what the steamboat world was really like for the women who worked on them. I didn't realize how big of a deal the invention of these steamboats was, but it really was created a huge shift in the economy in the South. and also what slave labor looked like. It gave slave women more freedom to move, a little bit more autonomy, as she talks about. And so she speaks on that here.
So the boats, right? So they are carrying, as I said, enslaved people, right, from the upper south to the lower south. They're also carrying freight, right, between these river cities, but they also become passenger boats. And so steamboat travel becomes this like kind of coveted experience for people who can afford it. And there are these advertisements that people put in newspapers that describe the accommodations and the kind of fare, the food, right, that'll be served on the boats. And so who facilitates this kind of service, right, is of course Black men and women. So Black men being often the chefs, right, or they're working on the shore, kind of loading up the boats. But Black women who worked as chambermaids, right, they would be washing the clothes, ironing, kind of taking care of the passengers within their staterooms. And so this kind of space within the boat is extremely interesting to me because the steamboat world and the steamboat itself have been kind of discussed as very masculine spaces. And the women who would have worked on the boats would have been one of just a few, if not the only individual, if not the only woman on the boat. And so these women, while they're accessing sort of wages possibly or kind of a freedom of movement, they're also being sort of surveilled in a particular way that can be threatening. And they're isolated in ways that I find point to the kind of duality of that experience. But I also find that, you know, they have a lot of authority on the boats. So there's one case in particular that I look at. It's like an insurance fraud case, and they're asking these the Black chambermaids about, you know, kind of their movements on the boat and the movements of the other workers on the boat. And I kind of read through that, them having this sense of like, you know, where people are supposed to be and kind of policing that space. And so I find that really interesting as well. So there's like a lot there in terms of their spatial practices and the significance of those. I found, for example, and this comes up in a lawsuit, right, between a slave owner and a steamboat captain. And these are some of the really rich documents that I am able to access to get these stories of chambermaids. And it's often because they have escaped, right? Because they've run away and been lost to their owner. And this is kind of the way that the language that they use to describe what's happened. And so in one of these stories, for example, a slave owner has lost his enslaved woman named Celeste, and he talks about how valuable this young woman is, how she speaks various languages, how she could have sold for, you know, $2,000 in the slave market because she's so beautiful. And then he has this really interesting comment that she never really made much money for me, though, you know. And so I find that really kind of interesting in terms of this question of motivation, because it seems like she was able to move through this space and navigate this space with some power and some kind of, you know, agency over maybe who she worked for or the kinds of trips that she took, so much so that she was able to escape to freedom. And kind of in the midst of that, you know, was never really interested in sort of bolstering the economic power, you know, of her owner. Never really interested in earning a lot of money or you know, I think of it as maybe she wasn't trying to do her job very well, right? She was just trying to buy her time until she could become free. And so, and I kind of learned through that case that her mother was also a chambermaid. And so I wonder about that relationship and the kinds of conversations that they had about the opportunities that that work could offer. So I think the motivation certainly varied for different women as they would for, you know, women in any period of time. These women are not bound to husbands and children in ways that many scholars might suggest, right? Or many historians have suggested, or people would maybe want to see Black women to be at that period of time. And I think the same still holds today, where Black women, we have so much symbolic weight, right? That sort of shrouds us and kind of covers us in our experiences. And so whatever opportunities that we take to move beyond these boundaries of, being a mother, being a kind of caregiver, as you kind of mentioned as we were talking about the grandmothers, it's really difficult for the Black community and society as a whole to kind of fit independently, wealthy or kind of independent women, single women into their narrative who don't fit this kind of mold of the family that we maybe want to see. And so I find that to be an interesting continuity almost in the history of Black women in this conversation around labor and kind of economic power and independence. There's always this layer of this kind of hope or this desire for Black women to be in these positions of like, you can cut this part out. I'm kind of like repeating, I'm like thinking through this, but like wanting us to be that strong matriarch and be that good wife and be that, kind of good mother. But Black women occupy so many different kinds of roles, right? And we have so many kinds of, skills and superpowers, right? And so the more that we can find frameworks to understand that and fit that into the history of our people, I think the better. And so that's a connection I'd like to make, between then and now.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 7 of Grandma's Roses. If you're digging the content, please make sure you hit that like button and that subscribe button, and we're going to keep trying to bring you dope content about creativity, culture, and community. Peace.